Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week it's the Tamiya motorised legs. We'll be fitting them to the Hercules Hobbies Reefer, and since it's all but a direct copy of the Tamiya trailers, it should bolt right up. Now I'm not going to install all the bits, I'm mainly interested in the gearbox and the legs themselves. The mechanical switch unit, as neat as it is, we won't be fitting, as we will end up with some electronics to do its job. We might end up using the servo plate on the truck though, but that will come later. Today it's all about getting the legs built, fitted and working. In the box we've got two plastic parts trees with a nice selection of bits. There's a complete coupler set that uses a sliding mechanism to allow control of the coupler and operate the switches in the trailer from one servo. The other tree has the switch box for micro switches and the gearbox halves. In the little cardboard box we've got the metal parts. There's the screw bags A and B, some coloured plastic gears, they look like the ones from the Tamiya educational kits. Battery holders, they come in kit form and probably plenty good enough. Some more metal bits, the racks for the legs, a couple of gears and some bushings. A load of metal plates, looks like the ones for the servo mount is the main one, and a tiny plastic tube of grease. In this one you've got some servo tape and an insert for a stick radio. A nice little brush motor, it's nothing too special, but it looks like it will be more than up to the task. Another little bag with some metal parts in. It looks like Tamiya hasn't spent too much time in carefully sorting out and labelling the parts in the bags. But there's not many of them, so it shouldn't be too hard to pick out all the bits that we need. Last out is the wiring harness, and as you'd expect it's all quality stuff. The micro switches have a good positive click to them, and the toggle switch is nice and positive too, but we won't be using any of it. The instructions are pretty good. It covers installation on the King Hauler and the Globe Liner. Most of the newer kits, like the Grand Hauler, have the instructions in the back of their manuals. There's one big thing missing though, there's not a parts list on each stage. Here's the Grand Hauler manual for comparison. It's really handy to have to make sure you haven't missed anything, and for sizing up the parts. Never mind though, I'm sure we'll manage. There's another little piece of paper showing the installation of the stick gate for stick radios. Basically you just stick it on with some servo tape, but we're using a wheel radio so we won't be needing it. Here's a nice little diagram of the mechanical install. The servo pushes the slide back and forth. When it pulls it all the way to the left it opens the coupler to disengage the trailer. Moving it to the right pushes on the blue bit mounted to the trailer, which moves the pink lever which operates the micro switches. It's a neat system, and back in 1994 it would have been the best way to do it, and keep it affordable. These days though, I'm sure we can do better. Before we can actually design all the electronics to make it go, we'll need a working set of legs. So as a stopgap to control them, we'll be using a 2-pole 3-position toggle switch. This one's centre stable, so mom off mom. You have to hold the switch to keep the legs moving. And to wire it up we're going to need some wire. There will probably be a few other bits along the way, but that's going to be most of it. Okay then, we'll start at step 9, starting the gearbox. Since we don't know when we're going to be needing the different screw bags, we'll just empty them out into some pots so we can pick and choose as we go. We'll do the same with the unmarked bags that we know we need parts from too, like this one with the metal racks in. And for this step we're going to need the motor and some of the coloured gears, so we'll unbag them too. Okay, the first bit we need is from yet another bag, a hex-shaped part with an M3 threaded hole on one of its flats. And now from another bag we need the 1.5mm Allen key, so we can loosely fit an M3 grub screw from one of the pots. So it seems that if you like hunting for parts, this kit is definitely for you. The hex part fits onto a drive shaft with holes at either end, but to make sure it doesn't come loose we'll use a little bit of thread lock on the grub screw before we fit it. It's an internal part to the gearbox, so if it does come loose it's going to be a bit of a task to fix. We only need a spot of thread lock on the grub, then we can install it in the hex and slide it on the shaft and nip it up. The shaft has a mark so you know where to position the hex. For now though, I'm only going to do it up tight enough that it will just about stay in position while we assemble the rest. That way we can make sure it's in just the right spot before we really torque it up. Next we've got the worm gear for the motor. So we get it in just the right position, Tamiya provide a jig that fits over the motor. All we do is slide the worm over the shaft and press it into position. Now I'm just squeezing between my fingers, which does do the job, but it's not the safest way to do it. I'm essentially pushing the shaft through the armature in the motor. To do it properly, you'd sit the shaft at the back of the motor on something hard and then press down on that. Now we need a gearbox half, A10, which will need cutting from the tree and the remaining nubs trimmed flat. The first bit to go in is the red gear. It will need a little bit of grease too, and we're going to try the stuff that Tamiya provide. There's not a lot in there, but it might just about be enough. We need a little in the hole that the post on the gear sits in, and some on the teeth. Next the motor, which needs a little bit of grease on the worm. Then the wires go through a hole in the back of the gearbox half, and the motor just sits snugly in position. The next gear to fit is the grey one. This time it needs a steel pin pressing into one side. It's a very stiff fit, but it's easy enough to do with fingers. Before it goes in, we need a little bit of grease on the end of the pin, and a little on the teeth just for good measure. Then once it's in, we can grease up the plastic pin that runs in the other gearbox half. Now for the last plastic gear. This one has a hex hole on one side that fits over the hex we fitted to the shaft. We'll need to grease up the shaft on both sides and add a little bit of grease to the teeth. The other gearbox half, A13, goes on next. It should just slide on, but it might need a bit of a jiggle to get all the pins to sit in the right place. The trick is not to force it. Before we fit all the screws, we'll need to centre up the shaft by adjusting the hex and grub screw. When it's nice and central, the grub can get torqued up so it's not going to slip. To finish up the gearbox, we need 5 M2x8 cap heads and 5 M2 plain nuts. The nuts fit in hex-shaped holes, which makes it really easy to assemble. A little bit of thread lock probably wouldn't hurt too, as I've got a feeling once it's fitted we're not going to want to be taking it apart anytime soon. One more thing to fit to the gearbox. The holes in the ends of the shaft need what Tamiya call spring pins. They look a lot like the usual little drive pins, except they have a zigzag pattern down one side. They're a little tricky to fit, but as long as you have them lined up nice and straight, they do slide in fairly smoothly. And there we go, one complete gearbox. Next up we have the legs at step 14. First we need the metal racks and 2 of the 4 silver coil springs. The springs thread onto little bosses at one end on the back of the racks. Quite a neat bit of detail. It will stop the springs falling off when we fit the racks inside the legs. And speaking of legs, we need the 2 B12s and the 2 little covers, the A15s. The racks need to be able to freely slide up and down, so we'll need to grease them up. The little blue tube is all but empty, so instead I'm going to use some of the grease that's left over from the grand hauler. We need to grease up the back of the racks along the edges, drop another spring into the other end of the rack. A little dab of grease on the end helps keep it in place while we drop it into the leg. Wipe off the excess where it's squeezed over the edges, and fit a cover at the bottom with an M2x5 dome-headed screw. Same on the other one, and we've got 2 legs ready to fit. Next we've got the little drive shaft assemblies. We need the spline shafts, the metal gears, 2 E-clips, 2 5mm washers, and 2 small bushings. The shaft has a slot in it for an E-clip, and as usual they just get squeezed into place. If you're worried about pinging them off, never to be seen again, stick your hands in a transparent plastic bag. On the smooth side of the shaft, we need to add a blob of grease on the E-clip. Slide on one of the washers, add a bit more grease, then a bushing, and on the splined end we just slide on a gear. Very nice. Now we can mount the legs up inside the outer bits. We'll need B8 and B9 for one side, and B10 and 11 for the other. And we'll keep them separate so we don't mix them up. For screws we need 8 2x8 self-tappers, and we'll be needing the 2 remaining bushings. The bushings drop into recesses in B9 and B10. Now they're not a tight fit, so a very light press with a screwdriver will get them seated. If they seem to need more than very light persuasion, use the cross wrench to avoid damaging the bushings. We're going to need a nice blob of grease in the bushing, and some grease along the rack. Then it can all just slot together with the gear and the shaft dropped into the bushing. Now there's something I hadn't initially noticed while building. The flat on the shaft on the 2 assemblies need to be facing the same direction when the legs are fully up. You can lift the shaft from the gear and turn it a spline at a time until the 2 match. If like me you don't notice and they don't match, you're going to have to take them apart again. Now we can fit the cover plate, fitting the 4 small self-tappers on each side. They're a very tight fit, so make sure you've got the right screwdriver. When they're together, they should freely slide up and down with no binding. If they're sticky at all, now is the time to fix them. Okay, now for the drive cups. These need an M3 grub screw each and some thread lock. As usual with drive cups, the grub screw lines up with a flat on the shaft and gets done up really nice and tight. This is where you want the splines in the internal gears to be matched up on each side so the legs go up and down together. There's one more thing to do before we can fit everything. The kit comes with some sticky back rubber to stick on the feet. To make sure they're not going to fall off, we'll give the plastic a good clean with an IPA pad. They'll probably stick okay as is, but cleaning off the grease can't hurt. We just need to peel the backing off the rubber and stick them on. They're rather neat little units. For those still wondering what all those springs were for, when we turn the drive, the gears move the rack up and down. When the legs hit the limit of travel, the rack keeps going, compressing the spring, clearing the gear. Quite a neat way to avoid stalling the motor if it keeps running too long. Before we can fit the gearbox and legs to the trailer, we need to remove the stock spring-loaded bits. We need to remove the trigger assembly. It's got two M3 screws that go into captured nuts and a self-tapper on the edge of the metal plate. The bit with the slider is a bit more of a pain to remove. The nuts aren't captured, so they just drop off into the abyss. So we're going to end up having a bit of faffing about to do to fish them out. The legs though come off very easily. There's 4 screws and nuts on each side, and we'll keep these ones and reuse them on the Tamiya legs as they're nice and black. With all the stock bits off the trailer, we can flip it over and gain access to those loose nuts. We can start by taking the end panel off. It's held on with 4 M2 screws, so it's easy enough to remove. Now we should be able to lift up the floor. It's held in with some strips of double-sided tape, which does give up its hold after a bit of twisting. A buggy front wheel works a treat to hold it up, so we can just about see the 2 holes near the cross member. The first bit is to fit the gearbox. Tamiya supply a pair of very nice M3 washer-head screws. They're going to spread the load a bit and be a lot easier to fit than separate screws and washers. If we offer it up under the chassis, we can see the thread pops up through the hole. The other side's going to be a bit more problematic to line up blind. It's going to be easier with the trailer on its side. Some thread lock on these would be a good idea too, as you don't want to be taking it all apart again every time they come loose. The front panel can go back on with its 4 screws, giving it a couple of taps to make sure it's all nicely seated before tightening up all the screws. Legs next. They refit just the same as the spring-loaded ones, except one side gets a metal plate to mount the toggle switch, which simply mounts up behind the nuts. Again, some thread lock probably isn't a bad idea here too. That just leaves some wiring. We'll be wiring up a simple directional control with a 2-pole toggle. I'll stick a little diagram up in the corner there, so hopefully you can follow what's happening. So first we're going to need the battery lead. We'll make it long enough so we should be able to run it into the toolbox if we need to. We can now split, strip and tin the ends ready to solder. And we'll also need to tin the terminals on the switch. So we can insulate the joints, we're going to need to cut up some heat shrink and slip it over the wires before we solder them to the switch. The battery wires solder up to the middle pair of terminals. When we switch the switch, it'll either connect the battery to the top terminals or the bottom ones. Next we need a short bit of wire to go between the top and the bottom terminals. The top pair just solder on to match the battery wires. At the other end we need to twist the wires together with the motor wires and tin them. This time, when we solder the wires to the switch, we need to twist it so it's in reverse. When we switch the switch up, it connects the battery to the top pair, which connects to the motor through the crossover. When the switch goes down, it connects directly. A nice simple polarity reverser. Now before we shrink the heat shrink, we're going to give it a quick test just to make sure it all works. I'm using a power supply with a current limit just in case. If there's a short, it's going to limit the current to just an amp and not cause instant burning and fire. A power supply with a current limit is always recommended to have on the bench if you like tinkering. With it connected, the switch should make the legs go up and down. Which it does. Very nice. Not sure which way up the switch should go, but we can always flip it over later. Now we know it all works, we can get the heat gun out and shrink the heat shrink, being very careful not to catch the plastic parts and melt anything. The switch can be fitted properly now. It just goes into the hole in the mounting plate, followed by a lock washer and a nut that's going to need to be nipped up nice and tight. And that is about it for this install. I can now get it onto some test equipment and see how it behaves and spec out some parts. If this was a permanent thing, you'd connect up a 4-cell battery harness to the battery leads and have at it. you could use the one that Tamiya provide, or possibly even a 5-cell 9mm receiver pack. It seems to work quite well though. It's a little expensive just for the legs, but there's not too much alternative for electric ones. I'm also going to stick a link in the description of a video I found showing off the mechanical bits to control the legs. It's a really interesting set of mechanical parts. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you're not, and apparently bourbons are better than custard creams, so we'll have to stock up. Bye guys!